In the faint pre-dawn hush of a December morning in Fort Worth, investigators paused over a small evidence box recovered from a long-sealed property locker, realizing that the single overlooked object inside, a worn soft-bristle toothbrush, might finally unlock a case that had resisted every attempt at resolution for 3 decades. The air around them shifted with a quiet, forensic dread that comes only when the truth, buried under years of dust and unanswered questions, is about to surface. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The winter of 1987 had settled heavily over Fort Worth, carrying with it the muted tones of an approaching Christmas season. Strings of lights appeared along Camp Bowie Boulevard, holiday promotions echoed through the downtown shops, and families prepared for the usual gatherings that define the closing weeks of the year. Against this backdrop of seasonal anticipation, the disappearance of 22-year-old college senior Margaret, Maggie, Rowen introduced a silent fracture in the rhythm of the city. Her vanishing, occurring just 10 days before Christmas, first registered in the local press as a worrying anomaly, then as a fear-laden headline repeated across front pages and evening broadcasts. She was described as a reliable young woman, studying early childhood education at Texas Woman's University while working part-time at a Fort Worth bookstore. She was last seen leaving her shift on a cold, wind-cut December evening, walking toward her aging Honda Civic in a partially lit parking lot adjacent to the shop. She never arrived home. The initial search effort began promptly, powered by family determination and community concern, typical of a town that understood itself as large but still interconnected. Missing person flyers, printed with a grainy snapshot of Maggie in a holiday sweater taken during Thanksgiving, fluttered along telephone poles across Tarrant County. Volunteers fanned out through wooded areas near Benbrook Lake, drainage paths near Interstate 30, and the surrounding suburban grids. As each search concluded without discovery, uncertainty threaded itself deeper into the collective consciousness of the community. The police maintained an active but measured posture, aware that many adult disappearances resolved in days. Yet, as Christmas approached, the absence of any new lead hardened into a distressing silence. When Maggie's abandoned vehicle was located 2 days after her disappearance, found near a commuter lot just outside the city's western limits, the temperature of the investigation changed. The car showed no immediate signs of forced entry or struggle. The interior was undisturbed. Her winter coat remained folded in the back seat, her college textbooks neatly stacked beside it. The keys were missing. The car's placement, a location she had no known reason to visit, deepened suspicions and removed the comforting narratives of voluntary travel or sudden relocation. It was the first physical anchor in a case that would slowly accumulate evidence but yield little clarity. Inside the vehicle, detectives gathered latent fingerprints, fabric fibers, and several stray blonde hairs consistent with Maggie. Nothing appeared out of order. Nothing suggested a clear perpetrator or motive. The crime laboratory, operating within the technological limits of the late 1980s, processed samples for comparison, but without a suspect for reference, these biological materials remained essentially inert. The lack of surveillance cameras in the commuter lot, which would later become standard, deprived investigators of what might have been the most valuable lead. Interviews were conducted with coworkers, neighbors, family acquaintances, and local residents. Each recollection provided fragments of routine, but none illuminated the moment of disappearance. The case trajectory dimmed incrementally, despite the persistent efforts of investigators. In the days following Christmas, as families returned to normal rhythms, the Rowen family found themselves held in a suspended emotional state that extended beyond holiday gatherings and into the new year. January brought colder mornings, brittle sunlight, and methodical, restrained updates from the police department. February arrived with equally muted progress. The investigation continued, the file thickened, and the leads diminished. A break appeared in early March when a land survey crew working near a lightly wooded area off Silver Creek Road, a rural strip west of the city, discovered personal belongings partially buried beneath accumulated winter debris. A faded wallet containing identification, a broken wristwatch, and a keychain with a small enamel ornament shaped like a book led investigators to confirm that these items belonged to Maggie. The proximity of the discovery site to a quiet access road raised the possibility of criminal disposal, but the absence of additional evidence rendered the significance of the location uncertain. They searched extensively around the area, but nothing further surfaced. While the find dispelled lingering theories of voluntary disappearance, it simultaneously opened a void of unanswered questions that would persist for years. During this period, the local media periodically revisited the case, especially near holidays when ongoing stories of missing persons tended to reemerge. The coverage maintained a tone of restrained solemnity, reflecting both journalistic ethics and the city's empathetic response. Tips occasionally reached the detective's desk, sightings, overheard conversations, vague associations, but none possessed the evidentiary strength necessary to advance the investigation. By late 1987, the case had transitioned from active pursuit to a quieter, file-driven maintenance overseen by a rotation of detectives. Progress depended heavily on new information, but Maggie's disappearance lacked the momentum typically produced by witness accounts or distinctive forensic anomalies. Her case became part of a larger archive of unresolved investigations preserved in a climate-controlled room inside the Fort Worth Police Department headquarters, where gray metal filing cabinets lined the walls and contained stories of interrupted lives. As the 1990s unfolded, the evolution of forensic science began reshaping investigative strategies across the country. DNA profiling, once an experimental technique, moved steadily toward becoming a standard forensic tool. Many unresolved cases were revisited in light of these advances, yet Maggie's evidence collection, though carefully preserved, lacked the contextual foundation needed for comparison. The stray hairs, fibers, and fingerprints remained in storage, representing potential only if matched with a specific individual. Her family continued to mark each Christmas with quiet remembrance, hanging the same photograph of Maggie on their living room mantel. Seasonal gatherings became reflective occasions marked not by renewed grief, but by a solemn acceptance of ambiguity. Her case remained present in the community consciousness, occasionally resurfacing in anniversary articles or local crime retrospectives. By the early 2000s, shifts in evidence handling policy led to the systematic recataloguing of cold case materials. It was during this administrative overhaul that the small object overlooked decades earlier, the soft-bristle toothbrush belonging to Maggie, was added to a new digital inventory. Initially, it was routine housekeeping, a task carried out by technicians tasked with ensuring accurate record keeping. The toothbrush held no immediate investigative significance. It was simply part of the personal property removed from her apartment when detectives first searched for clues in 1987. Yet the object would later become the fulcrum upon which the entire case would pivot. As new technologies emerged, forensic science enabled the construction of enhanced DNA reference profiles from limited samples. The possibility of extracting a clean, single-source genetic profile from an item known to have been in constant use by the victim offered new hope. However, budget constraints, case prioritization, and the overwhelming load of cold cases awaiting re-examination meant the toothbrush remained untouched for years, sitting inside a plastic evidence bag labeled with fading ink. By the mid-2010s, cold case units across the United States increasingly adopted forensic genealogy as a supplemental tool. This method relied not on direct comparison with known suspects, but on the broader search for genetic relatives within public genealogy databases. The approach had proven instrumental in solving decades-old cases, transforming long-stalled investigations into solvable problems. Yet, for genealogical comparison to be effective, a confirmed genetic reference sample from the victim was essential. In late 2019, a comprehensive audit of the Fort Worth cold case archive brought renewed attention to Maggie's file. Seasonal changes once again framed the atmosphere. Thanksgiving approaching, holiday decorations beginning to appear along the city's main streets, and with them came an increased resolve within the department to revisit long-neglected cases. During the audit, a forensic analyst reviewing the evidence catalog noticed the toothbrush entry, a potential source of uncontaminated epithelial cells. This discovery initiated a fresh sequence of procedural evaluations. In early 2020, the toothbrush was transferred to the forensic laboratory. Technicians used modern extraction techniques to recover a viable DNA sample. Its success allowed them to generate a refined profile of Maggie, one far more precise than the early forms created decades earlier. It became the anchor reference that enabled subsequent comparison with biological evidence recovered from items found near Silver Creek Road in 1987. Reanalysis of those items revealed previously undetected trace male DNA. With advanced testing, the sample, once too degraded for processing, was now usable. It was entered into multiple databases, producing no immediate direct match. However, when uploaded to genealogical comparison systems, a distant familial connection surfaced, linking the unknown contributor to a broader family tree located primarily in North Texas. Investigators began constructing an extended relational map, gradually narrowing the pool of potential individuals. This narrowed list, combined with known geographical patterns, prior criminal records, employment histories, and proximity to the 1987 search sites, eventually directed investigators towards several persons of interest who lived or worked within the Fort Worth region at the time. Among those individuals was a man whose past interactions with law enforcement involved minor offenses but no history of violent crime. His presence near the commuter lot in Silver Creek Road during the period of Maggie's disappearance, combined with new genealogical indicators, rendered him significant. Investigators prepared to initiate the next phase of inquiry, unaware that this development marked the beginning of the long-awaited unraveling of the case. Investigators recognized that solving a decades-old disappearance required equal parts caution and persistence, especially when the primary momentum came from forensic genealogy rather than traditional eyewitness accounts. The man who surfaced through the extended family tree analysis was identified as Ronald Dean Mercer, a Fort Worth resident in the late 1980s who had worked seasonal maintenance jobs across Tarrant County. He had no known connection to the victim, no record of serious offenses, and no history that immediately invoked suspicion. Yet the genealogical linkage placed him within the narrowed range of biological probability. Detectives understood that the science did not accuse him directly. It merely pointed toward a likely familial branch. Their task was to determine whether Mercer himself, or someone closely related to him, intersected with the case in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny. Before advancing, they returned to the original missing person timeline, re-examining the conditions of Maggie's disappearance. The weather records noted a cold, dry evening with temperatures hovering just above freezing, a detail that supported the preservation of biological material later recovered from the wooded area. Police reports documented patterns of commuter traffic near the lot where her vehicle was abandoned, as well as a list of individuals who lived or worked within a 10-mile radius. Most had been cleared long ago. Mercer had never been interviewed. He lived at an address approximately 6 miles from the location where Maggie's belongings were found, and his employment in December 1987 placed him at a construction site near the corridor connecting the two locations. It was not incriminating on its own, but it positioned him squarely inside the overlapping geographic boundary investigators believed significant. To proceed, detectives first gathered publicly accessible data: property records, employment files, archived utility accounts, and municipal permits associated with his past residences. They traced his movements from the mid-1980s onward, noting periods of relocation that aligned with the construction industry's seasonal fluctuations. They also cross-referenced his work routes with known traffic patterns from the era, supported by Transportation Department records preserved on microfilm. The cumulative portrait revealed a man who lived a largely unremarkable life, never attracting attention but frequently present in areas that overlapped with the case's geographical footprint. The next step required a contemporary DNA sample from either Mercer or a close relative in order to establish whether he could be excluded or whether deeper investigation was warranted. Investigators obtained discarded material lawfully, in accordance with established legal guidelines, ensuring that any collection could withstand courtroom scrutiny. When the laboratory compared the discarded item DNA with the partial male profile recovered from the evidence near Silver Creek Road, analysts produced a significant result. The sample was consistent with a very close biological relationship. The unknown contributor from 1987 matched as either Mercer himself or an immediate family member. This development initiated a more focused examination of Mercer's history. Detectives retrieved employment logs, paycheck stubs from archived businesses, and a copy of a driver's license application filed shortly before Maggie disappeared. A December 1987 work schedule revealed that Mercer had access to a vehicle and worked shifts that concluded near the time frame of Maggie's disappearance. Yet, forensic investigations required more than proximity and circumstance. They demanded patterns consistent with opportunity and motive, even when the motive remained undefined. With the assistance of retired detectives familiar with Fort Worth's 1980s infrastructure, current investigators mapped likely travel routes connecting Mercer's workplace to the commuter lot. The path aligned with roads undergoing maintenance during that winter, which explained why workers frequently passed through the corridor at unconventional hours. The possibility that he encountered Maggie, whether intentionally or through unexpected circumstance, could not be dismissed. Still, no definitive event tied them together. Attention returned to the reprocessed forensic evidence. Among the belongings discovered in 1987 was the broken wristwatch. Advanced microscopic examination revealed minute traces of skin cells in the crevices of the watchband. Earlier technology would have required far larger samples, but new methods allowed the recovery of a faint secondary profile. Comparison tests revealed a partial match to the same unknown male contributor associated with the DNA found near the wooded area. While the watch itself belonged to Maggie, the secondary biological trace suggested that someone had handled the item under conditions that allowed the transfer to occur. The discovery narrowed the field further and strengthened the likelihood that the unknown contributor played a direct role in the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. As detectives consolidated the evidence, They revisited archived witness statements. Though no one reported seeing Maggie with a stranger the night she vanished, several individuals recalled seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck idling near the parking lot late that evening. The descriptions varied. Some mentioned a dark color, others recalled a light one, and the age estimation ranged widely. No one had recorded a license plate, and at the time, investigators lacked sufficient leads to identify the vehicle. However, a search of Mercer's 1987 registration information indicated that he owned a pickup truck consistent with two of the descriptions. While not conclusive, this detail reinforced the need for a thorough inquiry. During the 2020 reevaluation, detectives also conducted background interviews with individuals who knew Mercer in the late 1980s. Most described him as quiet, somewhat introverted, and dedicated to his work. No one associated him with criminal behavior. Yet one former coworker recalled a brief period, not long after Maggie disappeared, when Mercer appeared unsettled, requesting time off for personal reasons. This recollection, while subjective and unverified, added another faint indicator that merited documentation. By this point, investigators possessed enough circumstantial and forensic alignment to justify a formal interview. They approached Mercer with the professionalism required for cold case inquiries, understanding that decades of time often create complex emotional and psychological environments. The interview took place in a controlled setting, designed not to accuse but to clarify. Mercer appeared cooperative, answering questions about his past, his work history, and his routines during the late 1980s. He expressed confusion about being linked to a disappearance he claimed to know nothing about. As expected in such cases, no admissions emerged and no immediate contradictions surfaced. But the detectives gathered behavioral baselines, observational cues, and situational knowledge that added nuance to the evolving investigative profile. Following the interview, investigators moved forward with a formal request for a direct DNA sample. Since the genealogical evidence and the lawfully obtained discarded sample established legal foundation, prosecutors approved the motion. When the lab compared Mercer's official DNA profile to the male DNA recovered from both the wooded area debris and the wristwatch, the result was unequivocal. It was a match. The finding provided the scientific anchor required for prosecutorial action, yet investigators also knew the case demanded a complete narrative reconstruction to present in court. They assembled a chronological sequence, beginning with the last confirmed sighting of Maggie leaving the bookstore. They integrated forensic results, vehicle abandonment patterns, and the geographical alignment of Mercer's known movements. They evaluated roadside conditions from 1987, weather data, holiday traffic, and timelines of shift changes at his construction job. They identified a plausible opportunity window between the end of his workday and the moment Maggie's car was parked at the commuter lot. Autopsy findings had never been possible due to the absence of remains, but forensic anthropology consultants reviewed the physical evidence discovered with her belongings and concluded that the item's distribution pattern suggested intentional placement rather than natural dispersal. This conclusion supported investigative theories that the wooded area served as a disposal site or intermediary location. The wristwatch trace DNA remained the most significant biological link. With the new DNA match, prosecutors possessed a scientifically grounded connective thread tying Mercer to the disappearance. Investigators also evaluated the broader context of 1987 Fort Worth to understand how the case could have occurred without substantial witness observation. The late evening darkness, reduced holiday staff security, and limited lighting in older commercial areas contributed significantly to the challenges of the original investigation. Public safety measures, including improved surveillance systems, would not begin to alter local infrastructure until the early 1990s. Thus, the disappearance aligned with numerous structural vulnerabilities typical of urban environments of that era. To strengthen the prosecution file, detectives traced Mercer's employment-related travel logs, discovering that he occasionally used rural side roads to bypass construction traffic. These routes intersected with the Silver Creek Road corridor. Additionally, earlier city planning maps revealed that portions of the wooded area were accessible via informal turnouts used by workers moving equipment. This detail offered a practical explanation for how he might have reached the location where Maggie's belongings were found. Prosecutors prepared a case summary that balanced forensic findings, timeline structure, and circumstantial reinforcement. They emphasized that while the motive remained uncertain, a common challenge in historical cases, the scientific evidence provided conclusive placement of Mercer within the chain of events. The absence of alternative suspects, combined with the genetic match and the geographic consistency, provided a legally sound foundation for charges. In December 2021, nearly 34 years after Maggie vanished, a grand jury reviewed the full investigative file. The cold, structured layout of the courthouse, with its stone facade and winter wreaths displayed along the corridors, provided a stark reminder of the seasonal cycle that had repeated each year since 1987, while the case remained unresolved. The jury returned an indictment for first-degree felony charges related to Maggie's disappearance. The arrest occurred quietly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public display. Mercer, now in his 60s, was taken into custody with the procedural calm characteristic of modern law enforcement. News of the arrest circulated through local media outlets, accompanied by archival photographs of Maggie taken during college holiday events. The community, long accustomed to anniversary retellings of the unresolved case, responded with measured reflection. Families who lived in Fort Worth during the 1980s recalled the original headlines. Newer residents absorbed the story as part of the city's historical fabric. While awaiting trial, Mercer underwent additional forensic evaluation to ensure no discrepancies existed in the biological comparisons. Laboratory reviews confirmed the accuracy of the results. The toothbrush-derived profile, once a forgotten piece of evidence, became the central reference point enabling the entire chain of forensic analysis. Without it, the identity of the unknown male contributor might never have been established. As trial preparations advanced, investigators continued to refine the narrative structure, consulting with forensic statisticians to quantify the probability of matched DNA belonging to an unrelated individual. The statistical results were precise and compelling, reflecting the robustness of modern DNA profiling. Prosecutors integrated these findings into their case, preparing to present the culmination of decades of investigative persistence. The upcoming courtroom proceedings would determine the final legal trajectory, but for investigators, the path to closure had already taken shape. They had reconstructed a case that once appeared immovable, using modern science, archival dedication, and the preserved integrity of long-stored evidence. The trial would offer the moment of public accountability, yet the case's true resolution had begun in the quiet laboratory, where a single forgotten toothbrush revealed the identity of a man who had remained beyond reach for more than 30 years. As the trial date approached, the atmosphere surrounding the case shifted from investigative scrutiny to legal precision. Prosecutors meticulously organized the evidentiary sequence, understanding that cold cases demanded unusual clarity. They needed to guide jurors through a chronology spanning more than 3 decades, highlighting investigative limitations of the late 1980s while demonstrating the reliability of contemporary forensic science. The courthouse prepared for a proceeding unlike most on its docket, one shaped by winter weather, decades-old circumstances, and the renewed focus that accompanied a long-awaited breakthrough. Seasonal wreaths hung in the hallways as if echoing the original timeline. December had always carried the weight of this case. The trial commenced in early winter, years after the toothbrush had reignited the stalled investigation. Jurors selected came from a range of backgrounds, many old enough to remember the era in which the disappearance occurred. Their familiarity with the technological landscape of the late 1980s offered a grounding contrast to the modern methods that shaped the evidence presented. Prosecutors began by establishing Maggie's life in 1987, her university studies, her employment at the bookstore, her daily routine, and the documented reliability that made her sudden disappearance so unsettling. They described the city as it existed then, emphasizing its partial lighting, limited surveillance, and the pockets of urban transition that created vulnerability during nighttime hours. The presentation moved methodically through the initial investigation, the discovery of her abandoned vehicle, the collection of physical evidence, the search efforts near Benbrook Lake, and the eventual recovery of her personal belongings off Silver Creek Road. They emphasized the absence of forensic solutions at the time and the ways technological limitations prevented deeper analysis. Jurors were shown photographs of the wooded area as it existed in 1987, accompanied by documented temperature readings and environmental assessments preserved from the original case file. The prosecution framed these details not to romanticize the past, but to articulate the investigative challenges faced by detectives who lacked the tools available today. Central to the trial was the role of DNA evidence, and experts provided extensive testimony about the evolution of forensic science. A senior forensic biologist traced the path of the toothbrush DNA profile, explaining how epithelial cells adhered to bristles through everyday use, creating a consistent genetic source. She demonstrated how the recovered sample was isolated, amplified, and transformed into a clear profile after decades in storage. The expert then discussed the modern techniques used to extract the secondary male DNA from the wristwatch, detailing the precision of methods that identified minute biological traces previously considered unusable. Another expert testified about forensic genealogy, describing the analytical process that produced the family tree structure leading investigators toward individuals genetically linked to the unknown male contributor. This testimony required careful explanation. Genealogical matches were not direct accusations, but statistical indications guiding detectives toward probable family groups. The expert illustrated how investigators narrowed the field by integrating genealogical likelihoods with geographical, occupational, and behavioral data from the period. This method, once controversial, had become increasingly accepted in cold case prosecutions, each requiring strict adherence to procedural guidelines. Jurors next heard from investigators involved in the 2020 re-examination. They described the rediscovery of the toothbrush during the evidence audit, the decision to prioritize it for DNA extraction, and the subsequent analytical breakthroughs. They also provided detailed accounts of locating Mercer's historical records, tracking his 1987 work routes, and identifying consistencies between his documented movements and the locations relevant to the case. Their testimony outlined each procedural step, reinforcing the absence of investigative leaps or unsupported assumptions. Prosecutors introduced photographic comparisons showing Mercer's 1987 pickup truck, alongside witness descriptions gathered during the original investigation. The images were presented carefully, emphasizing alignment rather than certainty. Jurors were reminded that witness recollections from decades earlier carried unavoidable limitations. Nonetheless, the confluence of vehicle type, employment routes, and timeline consistency created a meaningful pattern. Next came the DNA match itself. A forensic statistician explained the probability calculations, demonstrating that the DNA found on the wristwatch and the debris site was consistent with Mercer's profile to a degree of certainty that allowed no realistic alternative. The courtroom maintained a quiet, focused tone as the expert detailed statistical ratios that illustrated the rarity of such a match occurring coincidentally. Scientific restraint characterized the testimony. The numbers stood on their own. The defense constructed its argument around the passage of time. They emphasized the difficulties inherent in reconstructing events from more than 30 years prior, questioned the reliability of aged evidence, and attempted to cast doubt on the chain of custody for the toothbrush and other items. They suggested that secondary transfer of DNA could not be entirely ruled out, especially given the unknown circumstances under which the wristwatch trace was deposited. They asserted that the absence of remains created an unbridgeable narrative gap, and argued that the prosecution had built a circumstantial structure without definitive proof of a criminal act. Though the defense attempted to undermine the state's foundational points, prosecutors responded by reinforcing the evidence chain. They highlighted the meticulous preservation procedures followed since 1987, supported by archivists familiar with long-term evidence storage protocols. Records demonstrated that the toothbrush had remained sealed and undisturbed. Testimony from technicians confirmed that contamination controls were strictly followed. Furthermore, experts explained the difference between secondary transfer and direct handling, noting that the nature of the DNA on the wristwatch was more consistent with deliberate contact than incidental environmental accumulation. As the trial progressed, winter deepened across Fort Worth. The courthouse exterior, touched by seasonal lights, stood in stark contrast to the cold, factual tone of the proceedings. Local news coverage approached the trial with restraint, presenting archival footage that recalled the city's landscape in the 1980s. Reporters interviewed longtime residents who remembered the original search efforts. For many, revisiting the case evoked memories of that December, when holiday routines were interrupted by a disappearance that unsettled neighborhoods across Tarrant County. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution worked to address the absence of a known motive. They emphasized that violent crimes often lacked clear psychological explanations, particularly when committed impulsively or under personal circumstances not documented historically. They argued that while the motive remained unknown, the sequence of actions, abandoning the victim's car, depositing belongings in the wooded area, leaving forensic traces consistent with intentional handling, supported a singular conclusion. Jurors were reminded that motive was not a legal requirement when the evidence established identity and involvement. Near the close of the trial, prosecutors delivered a careful summation. They traced the narrative from the December evening when Maggie left the bookstore to the modern laboratory that extracted DNA from the forgotten toothbrush. They emphasized that every step followed lawful procedure, that every scientific result was independently verified, and that no alternative suspect possessed a comparable evidentiary footprint. They acknowledged the decades-long uncertainty faced by the Rowen family and argued that the weight of the evidence now allowed the community to confront the truth with clarity rather than speculation. The defense reiterated its concerns, focusing on memory erosion, environmental degradation of evidence, and the inherent challenges of reconstructing the past. They warned jurors against allowing the emotional resonance of a long unsolved case to influence their interpretation of scientific material. They urged caution, insisting that legal certainty required more than probability and forensic reconstruction. When the case was submitted to the jury, the courthouse entered a period of quiet anticipation. Winter sunlight filtered through narrow windows as jurors reviewed exhibits, examined timeline charts, and reread expert testimony. They moved through the material with deliberate care, aware of the responsibility placed upon them. Many of them had lived through the era when Maggie disappeared, and the case held historical presence in their own memory. Yet the verdict required an objective evaluation of scientific evidence presented under modern standards. Deliberations extended into the second day, slowed by the necessity of reconciling old events with new technology. Jurors discussed the significance of the DNA match, the plausibility of alternative explanations, and the structured reasoning presented by both sides. They considered the absence of remains, the deposition of belongings, and the statistical strength of the genetic profile. They re-examined the timeline, comparing work records, road layouts, and environmental conditions. Gradually, a consensus formed, grounded not in emotion but in the accumulation of consistent evidence. When jurors returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere remained steady, shaped by the solemnity appropriate to a case that had lingered unresolved for more than 3 decades. The foreperson delivered the verdict with measured clarity. They found Ronald Dean Mercer guilty on all counts associated with the disappearance of Margaret Rowen. The courtroom maintained decorum, reflecting the restrained tone of the entire proceeding. Reporters noted the absence of dramatic reactions. Instead, the moment marked a quiet pivot in a story that had begun in the shadowed parking lot of a Fort Worth bookstore in December 1987. For the Rowen family, the verdict signified a long-delayed acknowledgement of what had happened. It provided a definitive legal resolution, supported by evidence that had endured across generations of forensic advancement. Following the conviction, the court moved toward sentencing. Prosecutors recommended a term consistent with state guidelines for first-degree felony convictions involving disappearance and presumed homicide. The judge considered the age of the case, the strength of the evidence, and the enduring impact on the victim's family. The sentencing arose from legal standards rather than emotion, ensuring the proceedings remained consistent with the methodical tone that had defined the trial. Mercer received a sentence that ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in state custody. His age, combined with the length of the term, rendered the possibility of release negligible. The court maintained a factual demeanor throughout the sentencing, acknowledging that, while the evidence did not reveal every detail of the crime, it established responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. In the days after sentencing, Fort Worth revisited the story through an archival lens. Local newspapers published retrospective accounts outlining the evolution of forensic science from the 1980s to the present. Commentators discussed the importance of evidence preservation, the role of forensic genealogy, and the necessity of revisiting dormant cases that might now yield answers. Residents who remembered the original investigation reflected on the impact the case had on community awareness, especially during holiday seasons when routine shifts often introduced hidden vulnerabilities. For investigators who had inherited the case decades after its first report, the resolution offered a rare form of closure. They understood that cold cases seldom aligned so cleanly with modern forensic breakthroughs. The toothbrush, once stored without particular significance, symbolized the need for thorough evidence cataloging. Its role served as a reminder that even the smallest artifact, preserved correctly, could become pivotal in revealing a long-concealed narrative. As winter settled again over Fort Worth, the courthouse returned to its regular rhythm. The seasonal decorations remained along the hallways, understated yet present, echoing the same holiday period that framed both the disappearance and the resolution. The case, once a lingering uncertainty, now entered the historical record with legal finality. Investigators prepared to transition into the procedural aftermath, updating the cold case database, summarizing findings for internal review, and preparing documentation for future forensic reference. Yet the story of how a forgotten toothbrush unlocked the truth remained a testament to patient evidence preservation, methodical investigative renewal, and the steady advancement of forensic science. It stood as a reminder that some answers emerge not through sudden discovery, but through decades of quiet endurance, recorded in the preserved fibers of an object once overlooked, waiting for the right era to reveal its significance. In the months following the conviction, the significance of the case continued to unfold in quiet layers across Fort Worth. The courtroom proceedings had concluded, but the administrative and emotional echoes persisted. Detectives completed the final stages of documentation, ensuring that every detail of the investigation, from the earliest missing person report in December 1987 to the genetic analysis conducted more than 3 decades later, was preserved in a comprehensive case archive. The file, once a collection of unanswered questions, now contained a narrative of evidence-based resolution. As investigators finalized their reports, they reflected on how the smallest surviving piece of personal property had influenced the trajectory of a case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved. The Rowen family, while experiencing a measure of closure, approached the aftermath with quiet introspection. They had lived through 34 years of seasonal cycles marked by commemoration rather than celebration. Each December had carried its own form of emotional weight, shaped by memories of the last time they saw Maggie during the Thanksgiving break that preceded her disappearance. Now, for the first time since 1987, the approaching winter did not bring solely unanswered grief. The verdict provided clarity, yet the absence of a full account of the events surrounding her final hours remained an unaltered reality. Their lives had been marked permanently by uncertainty, but the legal resolution established a boundary between speculation and acknowledgement. Fort Worth residents who had followed the case across decades also processed the outcome in varying ways. For many older residents, the verdict reawakened memories of a city that appeared smaller and less illuminated during the late 1980s, when parking lots lacked surveillance and nighttime streets carried quieter, darker contours. The case had become an unspoken reference point in local conversations about safety, community vigilance, and the fragility of routine. The conviction served as a reminder of how far investigative tools had progressed, turning once insurmountable obstacles into resolvable challenges. Local journalists and archivists documented these reflections, producing retrospective features that traced the evolution of the investigation, the role of forensic genealogy, and the endurance of long-term evidence preservation. The Fort Worth Police Department's Cold Case Unit used the resolution as a procedural anchor to evaluate other dormant files. They examined their archives with renewed attention, aware that overlooked objects, items once dismissed as inconsequential, might now contain genetic or trace evidence capable of revealing answers. The toothbrush in Maggie's case became symbolic of this renewed approach. Training sessions emphasized chain-of-custody protocols, storage conditions, and the technological value of items previously considered peripheral. Each evidence audit became an opportunity to reassess what might be possible when paired with modern analytical capabilities. In broader forensic circles, the case drew interest for its clear illustration of how personal use items could become critical DNA sources decades later. Conferences highlighted the importance of revisiting early investigations, with an understanding that expanding technology often reshapes evidentiary potential. The toothbrush, while seemingly mundane, had retained sufficient epithelial material to generate a definitive genetic profile, enabling investigators to authenticate the victim's DNA and compare it to biological traces found elsewhere. The case demonstrated that the scientific longevity of even everyday objects could outlast generational shifts in technology and investigative methodology. Meanwhile, Mercer adjusted to the routines of incarceration. Classified according to state guidelines for violent felony offenders, he underwent intake assessments that evaluated health, psychological profile, and transitional behavior. His adaptation to the correctional environment proceeded without notable incident. He maintained a largely withdrawn demeanor, speaking little and avoiding conflict. Psychological evaluations documented a personality structure characterized by reservation and compartmentalization, though they did not produce insights explaining his actions in 1987. With no incentive for further disclosure, and having maintained silence throughout the trial, his internal narrative remained inaccessible to investigators and family alike. The absence of confession, while not uncommon in similar cases, preserved gaps in the historical record that no forensic method could bridge. Legal analysts reviewing the case noted its procedural strength, citing the meticulous evidence handling and the clear alignment between forensic findings and prosecutorial strategy. The chain of custody documentation, preserved across multiple administrative eras, had been essential to ensuring admissibility. The case highlighted the need for disciplined storage environments, controlled temperature settings, and rigorous documentation of evidence transfers. In many jurisdictions, the resolution contributed to renewed funding discussions for improved evidence facilities, enabling departments to protect materials with decades-long investigative potential. As winter gave way to early spring, the Rowen family engaged in the gradual process of reorganizing documents, photographs, and mementos collected over the years. They revisited journals kept during early search efforts, newspaper clippings preserved in yellowed scrapbooks, and the boxes of personal items investigators had returned once the trial ended. The belongings found near Silver Creek Road, her wallet, broken wristwatch, and keychain, had long been cataloged as evidence. With the case resolved, these objects were offered back to the family, though they accepted them with a quiet hesitation. Their significance extended beyond sentimental memory. They had become markers in an investigative timeline, artifacts through which the truth had eventually emerged. In the broader community, the anniversary of Maggie's disappearance approached with a different tone. For decades, December had carried the weight of uncertainty, often acknowledged through candlelight vigils, newspaper reminders, or small gatherings organized by family friends. Now, the month offered a space for reflection shaped by resolution rather than ambiguity. Winter decorations returned to Camp Bowie Boulevard, just as they had in 1987, but the collective awareness surrounding the case had shifted. Residents who remembered the original investigation found themselves reflecting on how time reconfigured both memory and understanding. The finalization of appellate procedures followed in orderly fashion. Mercer's defense counsel filed routine appeals, focusing on claims of evidentiary overreach and chain of custody challenges. Appellate courts examined each submission with procedural rigor, concluding that the trial had adhered closely to legal standards. The conviction stood without modification. The confirmation reinforced the stability of the forensic methods used, offering an additional legal benchmark for future cases involving aged evidence and genealogical analysis. Within the police department, a comprehensive after-action report documented the entire investigative sequence, emphasizing lessons for future cold casework. The report identified critical turning points: the rediscovery of the toothbrush during a routine evidence audit, the decision to apply modern DNA extraction methods, and the integration of genealogical mapping. It also underscored the importance of revisiting geographic patterns and employment histories when examining older cases. Investigators recognized that, while forensic technology had driven the breakthrough, the case also benefited from the persistent preservation of records, maps, and logs stretching back to the late 1980s. Together, these components formed an evidentiary chain strong enough to withstand modern judicial scrutiny. As the seasons progressed, attention gradually shifted away from the case. The media transitioned to other stories, and Fort Worth resumed its typical rhythms. Yet the narrative remained embedded in the institutional memory of those who had participated in the investigation. Detectives who had inherited the case late in their careers expressed a quiet satisfaction, knowing that persistence had finally aligned with technological capability. Retired officers who had worked the case in its early stages reflected on the contrast between the resources available in 1987 and those used in its resolution. Many acknowledged that the full truth could not have emerged without the passage of time, even though that passage had imposed decades of distress on the family. In forensic laboratories, the case contributed to research discussions exploring the durability of biological material on personal use items. Scientists studying DNA stability referenced the toothbrush as an example of how keratinized epithelial cells could remain viable through decades of storage. Case summaries circulated at professional seminars, highlighting the necessity of re-examining old evidence through the lens of evolving technology. The story reinforced the idea that a comprehensive approach, one that combined scientific, genealogical, and procedural elements, offered the best chance of solving long-dormant cases. For the Rowen family, healing remained a gradual process shaped by time rather than event. They continued familiar traditions, Thanksgiving meals, Christmas gatherings, and New Year reflections, but the emotional landscape had changed. Their focus shifted from uncertainty to remembrance, acknowledging both the life Maggie had lived and the decades of endurance that followed her disappearance. They established a small scholarship in her name at the university where she had studied, supporting students in early childhood education. The scholarship served as a quiet extension of her aspirations, transforming loss into support for others whose futures still lay ahead. The wooded area off Silver Creek Road, once a focal point of fear and ambiguity, remained unchanged in its physical features. Seasonal growth and weather patterns continued their cycles, unaffected by the history attached to the land. Visitors passing through the area would not recognize it as the site where critical evidence emerged unless guided by knowledge of the case. The quiet surroundings reflected the nature of the investigation itself, unobtrusive, patient, and shaped by details that only later revealed their significance. In the end, the case became an enduring example of how modern forensic capabilities interact with historical investigative work. It demonstrated that answers are not always immediate, but can emerge across generational divides when evidence is preserved with care. The toothbrush, forgotten for decades, served as both catalyst and symbol, a reminder that the integrity of even the smallest object can carry the weight of truth through time. Fort Worth moved forward, shaped subtly by the transformation of a cold case into a resolved chapter of local history. The courthouse files closed, the appellate reviews concluded, and the family entered a period of reflection that no longer carried the burden of unanswered questions. The resolution stood not as an ending, but as a quiet acknowledgement that persistence, science, and careful stewardship of evidence could converge to illuminate events that once seemed unreachable. Through these combined efforts, the story of Maggie Rowen found its final place within the historical fabric of the city, allowing closure to rest where uncertainty had once endured.